Back. So this is VR development for programmers. This week we're having another design topic. We're talking about perception and psyche. This is a very, very important discussion because we're starting to get to the point, and I was, a young adult in the 90s, and during the 90s there was always this big fight. It's like, oh, do video games cause violence back and forth, and that, those kinds of things. Do these games, make an impression on the human psyche? And a lot of it was fear-mongering and bunk and just, grown-ups, taking a dump on, the things that kids were enjoying, as has been done for generation after generation after generation. And so a lot of that was junk. Now we're starting to enter the realm that because we are taking the audience's standard perception of reality and either overwhelming it or adding to it, we start raising some of these bigger questions. So while we do VR, we start understanding more about human perception works and a little bit more about the intentional and unintentional impacts of being able to do that. So scientists, engineers, medical practitioners, we're still learning on how to leverage this to effectively communicate between human and machine, but also how we can maximize or minimize the impact of these experiences on our operators. So we talked about discomfort, and that was at a very low level, physiological level of perception. And so that's why we covered that. That was week 5. So if you're interested in that, I recommend go back and looking at the video on discomfort. Aside from that, VR is also a vehicle for potentially other problematic scenarios, right? So, and these could be intentional or unintentional. With discomfort, you could cause the audience to fall over. They could run into objects. They can, hit things with their hands. They can put themselves in danger. Even without a head-mounted display, I've seen cases where somebody's in a HoloLens and they've lost track of the world and they've walked into a wall. Or if you could imagine a malicious version of Pokemon Go that was leading people into traffic or something like that. So, sense perception is really much of the root of human experiences. It's unsurprising to find that there's some implications with how immersive technology can also play with human psyche a bit. So there are issues concerning trust, especially with a new technology, and some deep-rooted instinctual fears, and there may be some other issues that haven't been fully uncovered yet. I'm very lucky that in my job I've been able to start talking with psychologists and doctors a little bit and see some of the preliminary research. I think a lot of the preliminary research hasn't been replicated or maybe not as well substantiated as we might like. On the other hand, I think there's some things that are showing a lot of promise. So, talking about perception of the body in VR. So, one of the first things people do, they put on the headset and they've never been in VR before, and they look around and then they look down at their bodies, and there's either no body model present or the body that they see doesn't match their own body. And no huge surprise, our brains are very, very used to having bodies. Our bodies have always been attached. So now when our bodies are suddenly not that attached, it's one of those things like, oh my God, I don't have any legs. And it's very, very common that it feels kind of alien and odd, and it's a little off-putting, a little disjointing, and that causes some of the initial trust issues because people are already just immediately going into this environment, and then it's already from the get-go a little weird. That said, our brains are surprisingly elastic with our sense of self. So, even though it starts off a little weird, people are able to quickly get used to it and accept this kind of lack of body experience, as I like to call it. So, hands and tools, right? We've talked about proprioception a little bit, our ability for our body to know where one part of our body is without directly looking at it with another piece of my body. So I'm not looking at my hands at all, and I can touch my fingers to each other almost all the time and touch my nose, that kind of thing. And I don't have to look at it. I don't have to think about it. My body just naturally knows where these things are. So even if I'm not looking at my hands, I can do that. And again, classic example, close your eyes, you can touch your nose, you don't have to look at anything, that kind of thing. Our brains are very aware of our bodies, and it notices discrepancies. That said, it also tends to overlook large changes sometimes, which is fairly interesting. So Alchemy Labs, the makers of Job Simulator, found that using realistic hand models was detrimental to the immersive technology. So again, the subtle change from my hands to hands that look like hands but aren't really my hands, and therefore it feels like somebody else's hands, the brain had an issue with. However, when they went super cartoony, right, and so the hands were obviously not the player's actual hands, the brain didn't reject it as much. So when it was a big change from, real hands to uber cartoony hands, it was fine. It's just when they had realistic looking hands that it caused a problem. Again, if you wear a glove or something like that, then the brain will go like, okay, my hand's on a glove. It's really when you're seeing the skin of another person's hand there, that's kind of the worst case scenario for hands. And then also arm position. Right, we talked about inverse kinematics and arm position and whatnot, and the player could have their arm one way, and the model in the game might have a slightly different variation of it, and it's not going to track properly, and so it'll cause that proprioceptive discrepancy. People will notice. Sometimes they'll comment on it, sometimes they won't, but they will definitely notice. Extended physiological proprioception, what a suitably nerdy term. This is the mechanism by which we use tools. So when I hold this remote control, all of a sudden my brain is able to extend its sense of proprioception to the end of this tool. And so just like before, I can touch the tip of my nose with the controller with my eyes closed. So this is a really cool mechanism, and part of what happens in our brains is that we start tracking the hand quite as much, and we start tracking the tool. And so in games, what we often do is we will, when somebody picks up an object, and again, if you watch any, Let's Play Job Simulator, they do it, and they do it great. When you reach out with your hand and you grab a pear or an apple or a knife and you pick that up, the hand model actually goes away. It's not a hand model holding the knife model. The hand model goes away and it swaps out, and the hand goes away, and now you're just holding the knife. And some people will notice and comment on it. A lot of people don't really even notice it at all, and it feels natural because, again, that's how our brain naturally works. We've really evolved to use tools, and that's how our brain adapts to working with tools, is that it makes that substitution, and so we can actually make that visual substitution with very little impact. It's completely okay. Swap out the hand model for the thing that's being manipulated. And sometimes I've had players didn't even notice it. And so a lot of times that's okay. The other thing that people do a lot in games that also makes it very comfortable is instead of having hand models, they use the controller models. And so it just shows where the controller is. That's another excellent way to deal with the proprioception. And then, again, if you swap out that tool model, people don't even notice because you're just trading one tool for another at that point. Okay. So there are some things that are interesting about humans and how we perceive in the world. Most people who are entering VR have at least a decade of experience in the real world. Most of us have more than a decade of experience in the real world. And so we're very, very, very used to the material world behaving in a predictable fashion. And so we expect those rules. Again, we're talking about, years and years and years of experience of if I put my head through something that will hurt. People will, in VR, try not to put their head through things. So there's a number of things that this happens. Solid objects, player collision. So again, they'll try their best not to collide with solid objects. They'll lean over counters. Again, we just talked about that in the last session about leaning over and falling over, right? Even myself, I still naturally avoid colliding with virtual objects. I will duck and move around an object instead of go through it. I will step aside, an object in the floor instead of walking through it. I'm only wearing VR for a few hours a week, and then the rest of the time I'm still in the real world, and it just, it sticks with you that physical objects are physical objects. So it's really, okay to have, objects in the way. Just fully expect that people are going to walk around them, and don't ever require that the people go through things that they see, because you're going to have a lot of frustrated users or people that says those problems don't make sense. Like if you have a puzzle where you have to walk through a thing, I think most cases it's really not going to work well because people are going to feel weird about it. It will cause discomfort, and it's very counterintuitive. Floors. Just like our bodies are familiar with solid objects, we're also extremely used to floors. There are always floors around. We're almost always on a floor, or we are plummeting. One of the two. So one of the things that happens is if you want to root somebody in their spot, if you want to make it so that they don't move anywhere, get rid of the floor. Right? Put them on a little disc in the middle of space, and 9 times out of 10, they're not going to move a whisker. Right? If they do decide to move, it'll probably be in very small, timid steps. But, generally speaking, if there's no floor, they're not going to move. If you put them into an environment without any kind of floor at all, they're going to feel unsafe. They may feel a little unbalanced. So you probably want to make sure that there's some kind of floor there, even if it's not big. And again, if you want to restrict movement and whatnot, eliminating the floor is a pretty good way to do it. Blink transitions we talked about in the interactivity, I think. Or maybe it was the basic interactions. I'm not sure. One of those two classes. So blinking is, again, that's where you do a quick fade out. You move the operator and then you fade back in. So this is a very convenient way of moving somebody without causing discomfort. The speed at which the blink occurs is important, though. If it is slow, right? If it takes a full second to fade out and then you move them and then another full second to move in, that's going to feel very laborious. It's like, oh, this is taking forever to blink around. However, if you do it too fast, the same mechanism that edits out our normal natural eyelid blinks will also filter out the VR blink, and so the audience will think that there was just a hard cut from one place to the next. They won't be aware of that at all. So again, found quarter of a second, third of a second to fade in or out. That's about right. Play with it on your platform. See what you think. Get some user feedback. It's not a science. This one's an art. Just kind of play with it, around with it and see what you get. Height effects. This is another one. We're very used to our heads being where they are in relation to the rest of the world. So if the camera position is higher or lower than the player's real head, they will either feel like they're on stilts or that part of their body is wedged into the ground. So in these cases, a lot of the vertical movement won't translate right, which again may cause scaling issues or discomfort, or it will impact the ability for the player to do things like crouch and see through the ground, that kind of thing. Oculus Rift provides height information about the player. Vive and HoloLens are calibrated to the real world. So use the height effectively and with wisdom. So VR and therapy. This is a hot new topic. So now we're getting less physiological and more psychological. As we get more psychological, there have started being a number of uses for VR and different kinds of therapy. One of the most obvious is the use of VR for phobia therapy, where it might be dangerous or very expensive to have somebody in an actual environment, like using exposure therapy. So if somebody is super deathly afraid of airplanes, it might be really inadvisable to put them on an actual airplane. However, by putting them in a VR airplane first, it can help them address some of those phobias before you actually go out to a real airplane. This has been shown to be as effective in initial clinical trials. Now, I'm going to say this is initial clinical research, right? So these are also the researchers that want the technology to work because they're curious about it. These are the same researchers that may have financial gains if it does work. So there's still a lot of medicine and science to be done. So while there is promise, don't super duper hold your breath, but there is promise about some of these effects being, or some of these techniques being very effective. PTSD is another one where you can take somebody back to an environment, but in a safe way where nobody's shooting at them. Pain management for like dentistry. There is initial research that I have seen for people who have lost the use of their limbs for re-innervating the connections between the brain and the limb and giving people control over their limbs again. There are some initial cases where that has shown to be the case. However, again, there's still a lot of research in medicine that has to be done. Lots of stuff to be conducted to really determine the efficacy of these treatments. But there is a lot of promise for many of this. And there are also things, again, like the HoloLens is really good for people who have lost the ability to use the limbs, that they can use their head to point at things, and the augmented reality can say, hey, do you want to turn on the lights? And somebody could turn and look at the light switch, and the HoloLens can sense where they're looking at and then know that they're looking at a light switch and turn the lights on and off for them. That kind of thing. So it's a burgeoning area of research. Lots of exciting possible applications. There's lots that could be done here. On the downside, we also have to worry about conditioning, negative conditioning, and not being that, we don't want to be the people that are creating games that are creating sociopaths. So I've talked to some psychologists about this. This is kind of a hot topic question, right? Who's going to be the first one to cause somebody to have a heart attack in VR? With all these horror games, it's probably going to happen sooner or later. But also, are we going to create people that are disassociative with the rest of society, that kind of thing? And a lot of the things that, when I've talked with clinicians, they are not so worried about creating people that become sociopaths or something like that. However, what they are concerned about, which is closely enough related that we should be concerned about it, is the fulfilling the full body fantasy that some people that are already, probably abnormal in some way, are fulfilling fantasies about beating people. So instead of, I'm clicking a button and it's beating somebody in a video game, which isn't that realistic, now all of a sudden, if you had Grand Theft Auto VR, you have the controller in your hand and you have the person in front of you and you're beating them with a baseball bat, and it's that much more realistic, and it's fulfilling these fantasies and providing, maybe a physiological chemical response to that. And so it's kind of reinforcing these super negative behaviors. And that is a concern. What does it really mean? Is it really possible? Is it going to be a problem? We don't know, is the bottom line answer. However, it is something that we may want to be concerned with, because it's, bad people are a real thing. And so giving bad people their, wish fulfillment, in some cases, maybe that will mean they won't do it in the real world, or in other cases, maybe it just means that it's a stepping stone for them to fuel what they'd be doing in the real world. We don't really know. So I touched on fear a little bit. One other thing is, if we are able to deprogram phobias, that suggests that there may also be a way that we can instill phobias. So that's another thing that we want to be a little careful of. Be mindful of your snakes, your scorpions, your spiders. People are going to have some very strong visceral reactions to many of those kinds of animals, that kind of thing. So just be mindful of it. Even if you're doing, a horror game, there are ways that you can do it that aren't necessarily going to trigger that fight or flight response quite that hard. And people already have a little bit of trepidation when they enter VR anyway, and that's why I generally don't recommend lots of these horror experiences. Some people really do like them, and certainly it is a genre. I try to avoid it as much as possible, again, because I don't necessarily know all of the implications. So there are a number of things that when we start talking about fear and virtual reality, when you put on a VR headset, there's enough visual disparities between VR today and the environment we put them in versus the real world that they feel a little less balanced. And the subconscious is aware that the world of their sensing isn't the real world, that things aren't quite right. So because of this, there's often a heightened awareness, that at the beginning and end of a VR experience that they're very aware that something's a little off. And so that'll bring up adrenaline levels and make people a little wary, especially when they put on the VR headset for the first time. People can be very trepidatious about it. The other thing is if someone's in VR and they touch a real object by accident, that can be very jarring. Absolutely breaks immersions, but it also acts as a reminder to use caution since they can't see the physical world. And so again, they're constantly in their subconscious. They're being like, be cautious, be careful. So their senses are already heightened. They're already in kind of a higher alert state than they would be if you were just walking them through a normal room. Most of the VR systems, the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift, they have Guardian and Boundary system. I forget what the heck all the specific names are called. But there's a way to provide a bounds for the play space, and so that helps some. That said, what happens with that sometimes is that they're in the experience and they have that little barrier, and then they're interacting with the world, and maybe there's like a giant robot coming to eat their face, and their brain is like, oh crap, there's a giant robot coming to eat my face. I have to fend off this robot. And then those little orange girders or blue girders, depending on which system you're using, they go out the window. Like part of the brain says, hey, be careful, there's an edge here, but part of the brain's also going, oh no, I have face-eating robot coming at me, like I have to deal with face-eating robot. And so people will often go outside of those bounds as they are going through some of these experiences. At the lab at work, we've put up sound-absorbing foam. We put up Formicore panels, and then we put sound-absorbing foam on top of that. Basically because even when we had the sound-absorbing foam was late coming in, and so by the time we got it in, there was already a bunch of dents and whatnot in the panels along the wall. So we actually, I have a padded room at work, and that's where I do a lot of the really fun parts of my job. But yeah, it's padded for a reason so that people can move around safely. Most folks don't have that though. So again, their brains are constantly telling them to be cautious, be careful, don't trust exactly what you see. And so this can create some, understandable trust issues between the player. So there's an inherent lack of trust. Also, it's a new technology, so there's an inherent lack of trust with that. So what can we do about that, right? So our players already are going into this a little untrusting. We use chaperones. Don't override those chaperones. For some games, if you want to add extra padding inside the bounds of the chaperone, again, use the calibrated room. Make sure that there is enough space to do it. But by all means, put up real walls on the inside of the chaperone bounds so that the player has extra a buffer space between them and the real world. Communicating clearly. So this is one of the few cases where I'm going to say that there's stuff that's more important than immersion. And so trust is more important than immersion. Cues, both visual and audible, are used to help the people orient and navigate within that space. And so go ahead and be blatant with any kind of tools to help people understand where they are and how they're orienting, moving around the space. Absolutely do it. Follow through. If a user attempts to make an action, it's the job of our application to execute that action as well as we can, right? So we're enabling our systems to execute a requested action in an intuitive way. So, if you can't execute an action, then there needs to be a failure mode, which is polite, informative, and communicative. So in Google Blocks, you try to move things around and you try to move objects, and then if you're editing a node and you can't do it, it tells you. It just gives you a little beep. I think it shakes the controller a little bit, and it's just a nice way for the game to say, oh, I see what you're trying to do, but you can't actually do it. It violates some of the rules of geometry, and therefore we're not going to let you do that thing. Provide warning. Don't sneak up on your users. Right, so when something enters a scene, there should be sound effects that accompany it, especially if it's arriving from, off screen or a position that isn't well anticipated. So again, the front 180 degrees where most of the action should happen. If you have a character entering anywhere in the back 180 degrees, especially in the back 90 degrees, from the player, that back corner or back quarter, right behind the head, you need to be really, really mindful because people won't anticipate it. So you got to have sound effects and stuff. Especially also things coming up from the floor, things coming down from the ceiling, because all of this is really helping us to eliminate surprises. So, in-game events that surprise people erode trust. Generally not desired. Again, in some horror games you can do it, but a lot of stuff it's really unnecessary. Loud sounds, flashes, interactions which don't result in the desired action, control issues, navigation issues. These are all things that can cause some of these problems. You need to playtest. You need to polish your game. It should be as consistent and reliable as absolutely possible. And again, we've talked about horror games. Because the VR already brings people in, they're a little super aware of themselves and their immediate surroundings. Things that are designed to shock or surprise or disgust people becomes a lot more visceral. And also, this is especially true for augmented reality because the thoughts are inside the viewer's actual environment and it becomes very, very personal, especially when it's in their home. So you need to take care you need to have extreme care. Like, I've seen things in AR where you have your HoloLens and have robots bouncing out of the walls or whatnot. Something that, I thought of, like, this is a worst case thing. Like, if you want to induce people's, like, phobias, like, if you're looking for a lawsuit, try this one. Is have a HoloLens or something where it detects people's hands and then start making, like, spiders crawl out from under their skin or something like that. Like, it's amazingly hardcore, and you will give people nightmares and or potentially traumatize people. So don't do it. There's going to be limits here. There's going to be thresholds that you don't want to cross. And sooner or later, some developer is going to cross these thresholds, and there's going to be a lawsuit. It's just a matter of time. I'm pretty convinced of it. So don't be that person. Don't get sued. And if people come to me and say, Blake, why did you teach people that? I said I told them not to do that. They were ignoring their lessons. No, in all seriousness, no. That's really important. That even in the horror stuff, there are reasonable bounds that we would want to have. I know there was a Resident Evil that was kind of pushing the bounds of good taste, and a lot of people didn't really have a good time in that. And that's just getting started. Like, it could get far worse than that. So, that is my cautions. Yes, so horror stuff. Don't try this at home. Yep. Using it for therapy, for really good things. Yeah, I think that covers it for this week. Okay, so once again, I'll turn to the chat room if anybody has any questions or thoughts before we close up. Okay, we only have 3 more sessions left. So we're getting down to the end here. We're 3/4 of the way through. So if you are in my class at work, you should be well on your way to producing something. And if you're not, come see me, find me, and we will make sure that we fast track you on your way to making something. All right. Anything else? All right. No questions for this point in time. We still got a bunch of people in the room, but everybody seems to be doing all right. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thanks for joining in, and I hope you have a wonderful day/evening. Take care. Bye-bye.